Before entering the story, please subscribe to the channel, like and share to help me. Thank you. The boring history for sleep. How Charlemagne tried to standardize royal nap times. Hey guys, tonight we drift into the soft candlelit corridors of early medieval Europe, where armored knights shuffle past linen-draped beds and monks whisper prayers between yawns. You're in the 8th century now, curled up on a slightly itchy woolen blanket, listening to the rustle of parchment and the crackle of a low fire. The room smells faintly of beeswax, old wood, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of sweat. Hygiene wasn't exactly the star of the Carolingian Renaissance. And tonight, you're here to learn about something that barely gets mentioned in history class: how Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe, actually tried to standardize nap times across his royal court. Yes, the same guy who spent decades expanding his empire and reforming education also apparently thought that ruling meant deciding when people should lie down and snooze. Now, let us be clear, you probably won't survive this story if you're looking for fast-paced action or shocking plot twists. This is medieval history soft pillow, no battles tonight, just bedtime politics, imperial naps, and some suspiciously detailed records of royal sleep habits. But that's kind of the point. We're here to drift, not sprint. He's like that friend who insists on tracking their sleep cycles with 3 different apps, only Charlemagne didn't have an iPhone. He had scribes, lots of them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Mechanical clocks weren't really a thing yet. People mostly told time by church bells, sun angles, and the occasional rooster who took his job too seriously. So controlling naps wasn't as simple as saying, "Okay, everyone, set your alarms for 1:30 p.m. According to Einhard, his court biographer and, let's be real, a bit of a fanboy, the emperor had a habit of taking short rests after meals. Einhard writes that Charlemagne was moderate in eating and drinking, particularly in drinking, since he hated drunkenness in anyone, much more in himself. Others suspect it was just his way of managing stress. After all, running an empire the size of Western Europe is exhausting. You'd probably want a nap too. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized writing with the Carolingian minuscule script, so people would finally stop writing like caffeinated squirrels. And yes, he seems to have toyed with the idea of standardizing rest. But naps, those were fine. In fact, they were part of his daily rhythm, almost like a reset button for his very busy, very medieval brain. About when people closed their eyes, sighed deeply, and let their minds drift. It involved a lot of careful nudging, bell ringing, and what scholars now call soft power. Sometimes religious texts, sometimes Roman history. So picture that you're half dozing off, stomach full of roasted game bird, while someone mumbles through the city of God, politics, or just personal preference, not exactly Netflix, but it worked for him. Some think Charlemagne's nap policies were part of his broader health regimen. He reportedly bathed daily, which in the Middle Ages basically made him a wellness influencer. Others argue it was a subtle way to keep his court predictable and docile. After all, it is hard to scheme against the emperor when you're busy dozing off on a leopard skin pillow. Not just his own naps, but everyone's: court officials, soldiers, monks, visiting dignitaries. According to some scattered accounts mostly buried in administrative texts, Charlemagne believed that a properly rested noble was a more useful noble. A brief, dreamy reset that allowed the mind to quiet and receive divine inspiration. You might call it God's power nap, though let's be real, nobody knows for sure. Medieval people loved mixing theology with basically everything, including digestion, or at least a less cranky one. And let's be honest, dealing with groggy medieval warlords is probably not on anyone's wish list. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing that. Some think he was simply echoing the monastic schedules he admired, which broke up the day into little chunks of prayer, work, and rest. Others suggest he might have been trying to subtly control his nobles' downtime to keep them from, plotting rebellion. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge softly into Charlemagne's world. The year is somewhere around 800 AD, give or take a few wandering monks. He is listening to his advisors argue over land disputes when suddenly he stands up and says something like, "Enough. Let us rest, we shall resume after the midday sleep." It's not a direct quote, obviously, but it's the vibe. Imagine the awkward pause in the room as scribes scramble to write that down, quills scratching like tiny medieval ASMR. Charlemagne, or Karl der Grosse if you're feeling particularly Germanic tonight, is sitting on his high-backed throne in Aachen. He has already done most of the dramatic things we remember him for. Crowned Emperor of the Romans, unified large chunks of Western Europe, made a decent stab at reforming education, and standardized coinage because, why not? But what nobody really talks about is that Charlemagne was also obsessed with schedules, especially sleep schedules. In between signing decrees and fighting Saxons, Charlemagne allegedly spent a curious amount of time thinking about naps. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne actually formalized royal nap policies or whether later writers just exaggerated his interest in courtly routines. It's worth remembering that in Charlemagne's world, time wasn't chopped into precise hours the way we do it now. You picture Charlemagne leaning back in his carved ivory chair, stroking his famously long mustache, which, by the way, was apparently one of his favorite features, and yes, Charlemagne did nap. Quirky fact time. Charlemagne supposedly liked to listen to people read aloud while he ate and while he rested. Some scholars think this obsession with balanced routines, eating, resting, reading, praying was part of Charlemagne's broader project of unifying and civilizing his empire. But here's the fringe tidbit. There's at least one medieval commentary that hints Charlemagne may have believed naps had a quasi-spiritual component. Still, the idea of Charlemagne trying to manage when people slept might sound ridiculous now, but in his context, it was just another way to exert control. That leads you to wonder, was it about health? Historians still debate that. Either way, tonight, you're stepping into that quiet, in-between space of history, the part that's not about wars or king's speeches, but about the small rhythms of daily life. And you're just getting started. You settle deeper into the soft, shadowy world of medieval sleep, a world that, frankly, didn't follow modern rules. Forget your 8 hours of uninterrupted slumber. In Charlemagne's time, sleep came into chunks, often called segmented sleep. People would go to bed after dark, wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or two, and then drift back into what they called the second sleep. Some medieval folks believed the waking time between first and second sleep was actually the best moment to conceive children. They thought the body was well rested but not yet stiff from oversleeping. You can imagine Charlemagne sitting through a heavy meal of bread, roast meat, and maybe some suspiciously old cheese, then pushing back his wooden plate and stretching. The idea of powering through the day without rest would have sounded bizarre to most people in 880. Life was physically exhausting, even for nobles. Riding horses, wearing heavy cloaks, sitting through endless church services, it all adds up. Naps were a survival tactic. He wasn't just managing his empire's lands, he was managing its sleep hygiene, or trying to. Anyway, privacy wasn't really a thing. You learned to sleep while people mumbled, coughed, and occasionally recited psalms nearby. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of giving toddlers a juice box and a nap to avoid a meltdown. Less rebellion, more REM sleep. People worried about bad dreams. Nightmares were often seen as messages from beyond, warnings from saints, or worse, from devils. Some nobles slept with relics under their pillows to ward off evil spirits. You can smell the faint tang of oil lamps going out, the slow creak of wooden doors closing gently against the afternoon light. The court is quiet now, lulled into stillness by imperial decree. There's even a record of people using protective charms, written in Latin, that basically boiled down to "please let me sleep without seeing demons tonight." In Charlemagne's court, that probably meant napping in long halls draped with furs, the air thick with the scent of wax, wood smoke, and maybe a little mead breath from lunch. Maybe he lets out a dignified yawn, scratches his beard, and announces that it's time for everyone to rest. Medieval preachers warned people not to oversleep because it was a sin sloth, one of the 7 deadly ones. Sleep too little, you might collapse in exhaustion and fail your duties. Charlemagne, with his grand imperial plans and complicated political alliances, still had to deal with basic human stuff, like how to get enough rest, how to keep his people from burning out, and maybe how to sneak in a nap himself without looking lazy. Sleep too much, and you're practically inviting demons to mess with you. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believe sleep could open the gates to the underworld, or if that was just church propaganda to keep people from lazing about. And yet, sleep was also seen as a gift from God, a time for the soul to refresh itself and, in some cases, literally receive visions. There's a long-standing debate among historians about how much people feared sleep and how much they embraced it. By order of the emperor, all dignitaries will now retire for rest. You'd grab your cloak, find a quiet corner of the palace, and settle in for a nap. Maybe you'd share a bench with another noble, each of you trying not to snore too loudly. There was no shame in it. This was official empire policy. Some sermons framed it as dangerous a moment when the devil could sneak in. Others painted it as holy, a quiet form of meditation. Whether that's true or not, let's just say they had some creative ideas about sleep science. It was normal, expected, and completely different from the way most people try and fail to sleep today. You picture yourself in a cold stone room, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket. There's no clock ticking ominously on the wall, no doom scrolling on your phone. Some historians argue it was healthier, allowing for natural rest breaks, while others still debate whether medieval people loved it or just tolerated it. Either way, Charlemagne's world was full of people who napped, woke up, napped again, and didn't seem to worry about it. Even the high-ranking nobles and clerics followed this segmented pattern unless, of course, they were on campaign or stuck listening to another one of the emperor's long-winded monologues about coin minting. For them, naps were woven into the day to make up for lost chunks of night. Insomnia wasn't really a thing when nobody expected 8 uninterrupted hours. Instead, you fall asleep when the fire burns low and the night air presses in. A few hours later, your eyes pop open. Maybe you pray. Maybe you get up to check the livestock, or maybe you just stare at the ceiling, thinking about your day while listening to the distant hoot of an owl. Then, sometime before dawn, you close your eyes again for round 2. This pattern wasn't weird, it was life. The fringe fact here. Charlemagne's court was no different, and then there were the siestas, the midday naps, that were so common across Europe that they barely raised an eyebrow. Napping wasn't just for the elderly or the sick. It was normal, but there's more to it than that. Sleep was also tied to morality, so you can imagine how tricky it was to balance these ideas. Charlemagne seems to have landed somewhere in the middle. He respected the need for rest, but wanted it on his terms. That's where his obsession with routine comes in. Imagine being a minor noble at Charlemagne's court, shuffling into the stone-floored hall after a long morning of legal debates, only to have an official announce. Quirky side note, some medieval nap spaces were communal. People would pile into large chambers, or even lay down on church pews if the setting allowed. For Charlemagne, naps weren't just about health, they were about keeping people in line. A well-rested court was a quiet court. And yet, even with all this structure, sleep in Charlemagne's day wasn't always easy. It's funny to think about, isn't it? As you drift further into this world, you can almost hear the soft rustle of linen as people settle into midday sleep. Nap time isn't just a personal choice anymore, it's policy. You follow Charlemagne through one of his typical days, and brace yourself, it's not as glamorous as school history books make it sound. The man was busy, sure, but his life wasn't all swordplay and dramatic coronations. Most days involved an exhausting mix of meetings, religious ceremonies, long meals, and, of course, naps. Lots of naps. If you've ever wondered what it's like to run a sprawling empire on the edge of total collapse, well, apparently it includes mandatory downtime. You wake up with him just before dawn. The air is cold and damp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones because medieval castles weren't exactly big on insulation. Monastic routines included none. A midday prayer, followed by a period of quiet rest. Wine flows, but not too much. Charlemagne was famously moderate about alcohol. He hated drunkenness, especially in his officials. He thought a drunk noble was a useless noble, and probably a dangerous one. He carried wax tablets and practiced his letters under his pillow at night, though historians still argue whether he actually practiced in bed or if that was just Einhard trying to make him sound extra studious. Either way, he definitely preferred listening to reading aloud, especially during his downtime. Charlemagne, being a fan of both religion and order, seems to have adopted this rhythm for himself and his court. The court gathers in a long hall, sitting on benches at wide wooden tables, but eventually, there's a second rest. Not quite sleep, not quite work, a reflective period. Or was it more of an idealized routine written down later to make him seem disciplined and virtuous? We may never know, but records suggest he kept to these rhythms more often than not. Even the most powerful man in Europe needed a break in the middle of the day. Even Charlemagne had to close his eyes, sigh deeply, and let go of imperial concerns for just a little while. Some scholars think this was when Charlemagne did his best thinking. Others suggest he simply used this time to digest because, let's face it, medieval meals could be heavy. More bread, more meat, sometimes seasonal fruits, if you're lucky. Charlemagne listens to readings during dinner too, because who doesn't love a little Roman history with their roast boar? They were a deliberate part of Charlemagne's leadership style. He believed in pacing himself, in dividing the day into sacred and secular duties, rest and activity. It was part of what he saw as proper Christian kingship, a balance of work, prayer, and recuperation. You can almost hear the soft murmur of Latin prayers fading into snores, the low hum of a court settling into midday rest. The world slows down, time stretches out. No, this is a ritual. He stretches out in a warm chamber, usually in his private quarters or a favorite palace room. Sometimes he listens to someone reading while he rests. He was known to have Latin texts read aloud to him as a kind of medieval audiobook, possibly nodding off halfway through Augustine's City of God. He wasn't technically a monk, but he liked to live like one, except, with more armor and occasional invasions. Charlemagne liked to keep tabs on his vassals. He'd receive reports about harvests, church construction, local rebellions. There were always local rebellions, and border skirmishes with the Saxons or Lombards. Sometimes he'd dictate responses while pacing the room, his voice steady, but his feet aching from standing in heavy leather shoes. His day starts with God, as most days did in 800 AD. The Jugendliche help, but notice Charlemagne's mind is already wandering to matters of state. More meetings, more prayers, more management of the Carolingian Empire, which, frankly, was always a bit of a logistical nightmare. Roads were terrible, communication was slow. You couldn't exactly send a quick text to Bavaria if something went wrong. Charlemagne rolls out of bed, probably onto a thick fur rug, think bearskin, or maybe something exotic like leopard, because if you're going to rule Europe, you might as well treat your feet. First things first, prayers. You stand beside him while a cleric reads morning psalms, the sound of Latin murmuring through the stone corridors. Breakfast, simple, bread, maybe dipped in wine, and a bit of cold meat. Charlemagne wasn't one for fancy food in the mornings. Einhard, his biographer, claims he ate modestly unless you count the enormous quantities of food he could sometimes put away at dinner. But mornings, quick and practical, then come the meetings. Charlemagne holds what are basically medieval boardroom sessions, except instead of PowerPoint presentations, there are scrolls and scribes. Laws are read aloud, disputes are settled. Taxes are discussed. Charlemagne would pause these meetings around midday, not just because people were hungry, but because he believed rest was part of proper governance. After all, how can you make decisions about land rights if your eyes are crossing from fatigue? Imagine hours of listening to local lords argue about who owns which patch of swamp. And this is where the first signs of nap planning start to creep in. Some historians believe he structured his daily schedule to mimic the Benedictine monks he so admired. Now picture the emperor after lunch. He's eaten more bread, maybe some cheese, definitely some roasted meat. So here comes the nap. Charlemagne doesn't just flop onto a bed like you might after Thanksgiving dinner. Quirky fact, Charlemagne reportedly tried to learn to write, but never quite mastered it. After his nap, Charlemagne wakes up refreshed, stretches again. Remember, this is a guy over 6 feet tall, so imagine the sound of joints cracking and gets back to work. The afternoon is spent reviewing letters from across the empire. By evening, there's another meal, bigger this time. And after dinner, more prayer, of course, then perhaps some private time with family or advisors. Historians still debate how rigid this schedule really was. Did Charlemagne follow it religiously every day? What's clear is that naps weren't just a personal preference. There's something strangely comforting about this, isn't there? And while you might think of medieval rulers as battle-hardened warriors constantly on the move, the reality was often much slower, quieter, and frankly, sleepier than the legends suggest. So now you've seen the rhythms of Charlemagne's day, the prayers, the meals, the meetings, and yes, the naps. And you're still right there beside him, eyelids heavy, wondering how much of history was actually shaped by people who were just trying not to yawn too loudly. You stay close to Charlemagne as the days blur into weeks, and weeks into years, and the pattern never really changes. The empire expands, treaties are signed, wars are fought, but underneath all that noise, there's the constant, gentle pulse of his routine. Not the battles or the coronations that stuff is exciting, but the daily grind of running a giant, unstable kingdom, mind-numbing. Charlemagne didn't just want to conquer new lands, he wanted to organize them. He ordered schools to teach Latin properly, so people would stop writing contracts in half-invented regional dialects. And, yes, he even tried to standardize sleep. If people rested at the same times, they'd be more productive together, more harmonious, easier to govern, or at least, that was the theory. But nestled between the agricultural rules are hints about daily routines. Why? Historians still argue whether this was for medicine, cooking, or some bizarre court hobby involving exotic animals. Midday rest wasn't just a luxury, it was a requirement, especially for his courtiers and administrative staff. Think of it like an early version of corporate time blocking. If everyone napped at the same time, no one would interrupt each other. There'd be no awkward moments where one official is asleep while another is demanding an audience. Everything would flow smoothly. He saw his rule as divinely ordained, which meant every part of life, including naps, had a moral dimension. Not everyone in the empire lived the same life. Farmers couldn't always drop everything to nap when the emperor said so. Soldiers on campaign didn't exactly have time for scheduled siestas while marching through enemy territory. And nobles who ran large estates often made their own rules. Rest wasn't just about avoiding burnout, it was about aligning yourself with the cosmic order. They warned that, if you napped when you weren't supposed to, you might have unclean dreams or wake up in a state of spiritual laziness. Charlemagne probably loved this idea. It gave him extra ammo to convince people that his nap schedule wasn't just smart, it was holy. His empire was so big it stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, but in his mind, it could still operate like one giant monastery, humming along in perfect order. Work when God wants you to work. Sleep when God wants you to sleep. Simple, right? Like organizing a toddler's day. Breakfast at 8, playtime until noon, then nap. Except instead of toddlers, you've got bickering nobles and restless bishops. And instead of juice boxes, you've got goblets of mead. The guards lean against cool stone walls, eyes drooping. The emperor stretches out in his chamber, the sound of his own deep breathing filling the room. Outside, the horses stamp in their stalls, knowing instinctively that nothing much is going to happen for the next hour or two. Imagine being a minor official, hunched over parchment all morning, and then being told, by imperial decree, it's nap time. You'd roll up your scrolls, sigh with relief, and maybe lie down under your desk. Problem solved. Either way, it gives you a glimpse of just how oddly specific Charlemagne's instructions could be. When to start work, when to break for meals, when to stop and rest. Historians still debate how strictly these nap rules were enforced. Some believe they were more of a suggestion and aspirational model for how the empire should run. And when the workday got too long, well, there was always rest. Not because you were lazy, but because the emperor himself said so. Others think Charlemagne was dead serious about it, especially in his court at Aachen, where his word was law. Outside the royal palaces, though, well, peasants probably kept doing whatever work to get through the day. It's not exactly a corporate handbook, but it's close. Which, of course, led him straight into his biggest obsession, standardization. Prayers, meals, meetings, and sleep. It's a medieval time management chart, probably written in painstaking Latin by a sleepy scribe who just wanted to break himself. Over and over again, like clockwork, well, medieval clockwork, which is to say, no actual clocks, just bells and the position of the sun. Here's the thing no one tells you about empire building. It's boring. You'd wake up at dawn, pray, work until midday, then stop for rest. After the nap, there'd be more work, more prayer, and eventually sleep again after sunset. It was a schedule that blurred the line between monk and monarch. You imagine him pacing his chambers in Aachen, frowning at a scroll. How many feet are in a yard? Well, that depends. Are you in Saxony, Lombardy, or Aquitaine? What's a bushel of grain? Again, it varies. This drove Charlemagne nuts. He wanted his empire to run smoothly, like one big machine, but it was more like 15 machines duct-taped together, each running on a different power cord. So, he started issuing edicts to make things uniform. He standardized weights and measures. He pushed for a consistent coinage system. That's where his nap time rules come in. Charlemagne believed in schedules, and he believed those schedules should apply to everyone from the humblest monk to the highest noble. Now picture the court again, but this time with scrolls pinned to walls, official proclamations detailing when to work, when to eat, when to pray, and when to rest. One of Charlemagne's more famous documents, the Capitulaire de Villis, is mostly about how royal estates should be run, things like planting gardens, tending livestock, and making sure the bees are happy. Quirky detail, the Capitulaire also mentions storing bear fat and crocodile skins. When it came to naps, he wanted consistency. But this wasn't just about comfort. Charlemagne believed that synchronized rest would lead to synchronized productivity. At least, that was the dream. For Charlemagne's inner circle, though, these rhythms became part of daily life. And for Charlemagne, the lines between secular and sacred were always blurry, except, of course, it wasn't that simple. Still, Charlemagne kept trying. He saw standardization as the key to empire building. Uniform currency, uniform law, uniform sleep. It's a charming idea when you think about it. Quirky side note? Some monks of the time believed that sleeping at the wrong hours could actually open you up to sin. So now you're starting to see how Charlemagne's empire worked, at least in theory. Everything on a schedule, everything under control. You imagine the royal court again, drifting into its midday quiet. The scribes roll up their scrolls. In this empire, even time itself takes a nap. The longer you stick around Charlemagne's court, the more you realize something. Naps aren't just naps anymore. They become political tools. Every hour of the day is now part of a grand, imperial schedule, and rest is woven right into the fabric of governance. Charlemagne wants his counts and bishops to follow the same rhythm no matter where they are. Morning labor, midday rest, afternoon labor, evening prayers, rinse and repeat. If you're not napping at the prescribed time, you're basically committing a tiny act of rebellion. The reality is, farmers keep farming when the weather is good and sleep when they can. But in monasteries and royal estates, people take Charlemagne's nap rules seriously. Better do it before lunch, or you'll find him horizontal and unreachable. Not everyone agrees on when midday actually is. Without clocks, timekeeping is a bit of an art. Some officials use sundials, but those aren't exactly portable. Others just watch the shadows or go by gut feeling. Did the bell ring? Did the abbot yawn? It wasn't just about taxes and armies. He wanted to shape the daily experiences of his people, from their prayers to their meals to the very moments they closed their eyes. It's a level of micromanagement that would make modern bosses seem hands-off. Okay, nap time. Charlemagne wasn't forcing people to work longer. He was forcing them to rest. Scrolls moved from one city to another. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. Traders bartered goods in dusty marketplaces. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a quiet period fell over the land, each day a kind of imperial hush. Sleep became a state policy, woven into the fabric of daily life, as important as taxes and tithes. Eyes drooping, breath steady, the afternoon sun pouring through wooden shutters, painting golden stripes on cold stone floors. Some monks probably exaggerated how closely they stuck to the schedule, just to look good in reports. Others took full advantage, stretching their naps into full-on afternoon slumbers. But given his obsession with governance, you wouldn't be surprised if his dreams involved neat rows of well-behaved citizens, all resting and rising on cue. It's one of the few royal decrees in history that essentially says, put down your plow and take a break. Court life becomes a strange dance of urgency and patience. One nobleman insists that midday starts at the 11th hour. Did Charlemagne's officials dream of policy reforms? Did peasants dream of better weather for crops? Did monks dream of more talking fish when exactly is after the main meal? And how long is sufficient rest for the body? Is 15 minutes enough? Or do you need a full 2-hour siesta to comply with imperial policy? Another says it's the 6th hour, like in Roman times. Even the dogs outside the palace seem to sense the shift, curling up under tables to snooze. Someone else claims it depends on the season because, obviously, the sun doesn't rise and set at the same time in winter and summer. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne accounted for these seasonal shifts in his nap decrees, or whether his officials just made it up as they went along. Work hard in the morning, then surrender to sleep. No exceptions, or at least, not officially. In fact, monks might have been the only group excited about the idea. They already had strict daily schedules, so adding an official imperial nap slot just gave them one more reason to pause. You watch as royal messengers called Missi Dominici are dispatched across the empire, carrying not just laws and taxes, but also guidelines for how people should structure their days. Dreams were seen as potential messages from God, or at least, that's what they claimed when they accidentally dozed off during a reading of the Psalms. He just wanted his empire to be organized, and synchronized rest felt like part of that. If you skipped your nap, you risked upsetting your black bile, or yellow bile, two substances you don't T1 out of whack unless you enjoy medieval medicine. Spoiler, you don't. So in a way, Charlemagne's nap policy wasn't just political. It was medical. In his mind, orderly sleep meant orderly lives. People who napped on schedule were less likely to get cranky, start fights, or make bad decisions. Which, frankly, might have been true. There's a record from the monastery of Fulda where a monk confessed to dreaming about a talking fish during his midday rest. Historians still argue whether that was symbolic or just the result of bad eel stew. It's a neat idea, but enforcing it, that's another story. Travel with one of these Missi Dominici as he rides into a village in Burgundy. Dust clings to his cloak, his horse is sweaty, and the villagers eye him nervously. He unrolls a scroll and reads aloud in Latin. Most of the crowd doesn't understand a word. Somewhere in the middle of the decree, there's a note about proper rest periods. Peasants glance at each other, wondering if this means they actually have to stop work in the middle of the harvest to take a nap. Probably not. Quirky detail. Some monasteries even recorded dreams in their chronicles. Back at court, you notice the mood shift. People start timing their business around naps. You want to deliver a petition to the emperor. But here's where things get tricky. This leads to disputes. You can almost hear the arguments echoing through the palace halls. Charlemagne, for his part, probably wasn't sweating these details. Quirky side note. Some medieval physicians believed that napping after eating helped balance the body's humors. But there's another layer, too. By regulating rest, Charlemagne reinforced the idea that his rule touched every part of life. And yet, despite all this control, there's something oddly gentle about it. Of course, enforcement was inconsistent. A noble in Bavaria might follow the rules to the letter, while a village in the Alps might ignore them completely. You wonder how many imperial dreams drifted through medieval pillows during these mandated rests. No one recorded the exact contents of Charlemagne's own naps. The empire kept running, of course, though perhaps a little more slowly now. Birdsong took over where conversation stopped. Fires crackled gently in hearths. The sound of quills scratching parchment paused for a while. This was Charlemagne's empire at rest. Not conquered by force this time, but lulled into submission by routine. And through it all, you're still right there, watching the empire rise and fall in slow, sleepy rhythms. Nap time, by royal command. As you drift deeper into Charlemagne's world, you start to notice something peculiar about these royal naps. They're not just for health, or order, or even piety anymore. They become a form of control, a political lever disguised as leisure. You'd think forcing naps on people would make you a benevolent ruler, but as it turns out, the way you structure someone's day says a lot about who's in charge of their life. Not because he's tired, but because if he doesn't follow the royal nap schedule, he might be accused of disobedience or, worse, disrespecting the emperor's divine mandate. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne's naptime policies were more about actual rest or about asserting his authority over the upper class. You can almost imagine the conversations. My lord, I regret to inform you that Count Hugo was seen pacing his garden at the 12th hour. Clearly defying the napping ordinance, there's a story possibly apocryphal about a courtier who claimed he dreamed of a battle outcome during his midday rest, only to wake up and report it to the emperor. The cooks didn't get to nap when there was bread to bake. The stable boys still had to water the horses, and the guards. But I haven't closed my eyes since Tuesday. Sleep becomes a new form of class division. The wealthy rest, the poor labor on. Well, somebody had to stay awake and make sure no one stormed the palace while the emperor was drooling into his embroidered pillow. Fewer conflicts meant a stronger empire. He's not interested in the little exceptions. He wants big picture order. Before that, different regions had their own chant styles. Charlemagne wasn't having it. He wanted one empire, one songbook, one schedule including nap times, and really, how do you argue with that? Remember, Charlemagne saw himself as a holy ruler, almost like a secular bishop in armor. His daily schedule mirrored monastic life because, in his mind, government wasn't separate from religion. In the outer provinces, places like Brittany, Saxony, or parts of Lombardy, local customs still ruled daily life. Over and over, like a song on repeat, the scribes record the day's events. The cooks prepare the next meal, the guards yawn behind their spears. Farmers worked when the weather told them to. Hunters tracked game according to the seasons, not the emperor's nap edict. Soldiers kept odd hours depending on the campaign. You can exactly schedule a siege between noon and 2, and then pause, because it's time for a royal rest. To govern well, you had to live righteously, and righteous living included proper rest. Was this empire-wide napping really happening everywhere, or just in Aachen and a few select monasteries? The records don't give a definitive answer. But the fact that the rules existed tells you something about the emperor's mindset. And for him, naps are just one part of a larger plan to create what modern scholars sometimes call the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of cultural revival and systematization. Charlemagne, according to the tale, nodded solemnly and then promptly changed his military strategy. And in a medieval court, hierarchy decides who naps and who doesn't. If you're a high-ranking official, you stretch out on your chaise lounge. He's trying to tame the day, slice it into neat little portions, and assign each slice a purpose. Work here, pray there, nap now, wake later. It's not just micromanagement, it's cosmology. For Charlemagne, ruling the empire means ruling the clock. If you're a servant, you keep sweeping until the floors gleam. Even the writing style is being cleaned up thanks to something called Carolingian minuscule, a new standardized script that's easier to read. Before that, reading a manuscript was like trying to decipher someone's medical prescription pad. Afterward, neatly spaced letters, clear punctuation. It's basically medieval Helvetica. Whether or not that actually happened, it shows you how seriously people took dreams in this era. Sleep wasn't just downtime. It was a portal to divine insight. Did this actually happen? Well, historians still argue about that too. But knowing medieval politics, it wouldn't be surprising. By setting specific times for rest, Charlemagne was quietly tightening his grip on the aristocracy. Remember, the nobles weren't always eager to follow orders from the top. They liked their independence, their regional customs, their long afternoon feasts. But now the emperor was telling them when to close their eyes. You picture a baron in Bavaria, reluctantly reclining on a carved wooden couch, one eye half open, muttering, "This is ridiculous," but he does it anyway. The court, meanwhile, hums along like a giant sleep experiment. The emperor's attendants develop a whole etiquette around rest. You don't knock on someone's chamber door during nap time. You don't start a debate about taxation policy while the scribe is snoring under his writing desk. And you definitely don't interrupt Charlemagne himself when he's lying back in his throne chair, eyes closed, hands folded, breathing slow and steady. There are even rumors of court spies who report on nobles skipping their mandated rest. Quirky side note. Some members of Charlemagne's court believed naps could sharpen prophetic dreams. But not everyone was buying it. You can almost hear the grumbles in the palace kitchens. That's the thing about standardized rest. It works great on paper, but in real life, someone always has to stay alert. This creates tension, resentment bubbles under the surface. You imagine whispered complaints in the servants' quarters. Oh sure, the emperor gets his nap. Still, Charlemagne presses forward with his vision. Think about it. Schools are opening. Monasteries are copying manuscripts. Architecture is getting fancier. And through all this cultural reform, rest remains central. Charlemagne believed that a well-rested official made fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant fewer conflicts. Quirky historical tidbit. The emperor also standardized music. That's right, Gregorian chant became uniform partly because of Charlemagne's efforts to regulate liturgical practice. But there's another layer to this, the spiritual side. You can almost hear the sermons from the palace chapel. Even the Lord rested on the seventh day. Shall we not also rest at the appointed hour? Of course, not everyone in the empire was reading from the same hymn sheet. Historians still discuss how much of Charlemagne's standardized schedule was aspirational versus actually practiced. You picture Charlemagne pacing the halls of his palace, pondering not just laws and battles, but the flow of time itself. And so, life in his court continues on this strange rhythm. Morning meetings, midday naps, afternoon councils, evening prayers. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the emperor lies back in his chamber, eyes fluttering shut, dreams drifting softly through his mind, dreams of a perfectly ordered world, where even sleep obeys the crown. You wake up metaphorically, of course, right in the middle of Charlemagne's well-oiled nap regime. The empire seems peaceful, the days predictable, but as you keep observing, you notice cracks in the system. Charlemagne's realm stretches from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from northern Italy to the North Sea. That's a lot of geography to regulate. And in case you haven't checked a medieval map lately, time zones aren't really a thing yet. Not everyone is thrilled about nap time governance. In fact, some of the emperor's top advisors begin to whisper concerns. There's a growing debate in the intellectual circles of the time. Is time something humans can control, or is it ordained by God? Charlemagne's policy seems to suggest that with enough decrees, you can slice time into useful chunks, but some theologians push back. He issues new capitularies. Those are royal orders carved into law, emphasizing not just when to nap, but how to structure the rest of the day. The same way he standardized coinage, weights, and measures, he wants to unify time. If everyone rests at the same hour, they're all symbolically part of the same empire. It is kind of like an 8th century version of setting your watch to imperial standard time. Eat, work, pray, sleep, repeat. In Charlemagne's empire, following the nap schedule became a symbol of loyalty to the crown. Military commanders in the field adjusted the schedule however they needed. You can exactly tell your troops to pause a siege because it's time for a state-mandated doze. They weren't very accurate, but they dripped water into a basin to measure time passing. Peasants took rest when they needed it during the heat of the day or after finishing chores. You start by regulating naps, and soon you're regulating everything else. Trade routes, legal codes, church appointments. Even what people sing in church, all of it ties back to control. Naps weren't just about rest, they were about identity. To nap at the imperial hour was to be part of Charlemagne's grand experiment in civilization. Some sources suggest Charlemagne's soldiers carried pocket sundials, adjusting their routines even in the field. Others say that's just a medieval myth, like Viking helmets with horns. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some healers of the time believed that napping at the wrong hour could cause vapors of the spleen to rise, leading to melancholy. Essentially, if you slept when your body wasn't ready, you risked feeling sad or sluggish. Whether Charlemagne knew this is unclear, but you can bet at least a few courtiers blamed their grumpiness on mistimed naps. You can imagine nobles quietly wondering, is it really the emperor's job to tell me when to close my eyes? In a way, it's a medieval version of work-life balance discussions. And each day, somewhere between work and prayer, came that mandatory pause, a brief window when the powerful closed their eyes, not just for health, but for harmony. How much of your day belongs to the state, and how much is yours? Shepherds napped in fields, leaning against warm stones. Bakers caught quick dozes between loaves. Most people treated the royal nap rules as something for the elites, like silk robes or complicated titles. If you're knee-deep in mud planting barley, the emperor's sleep schedule feels very far away. You can picture a royal attendant squinting at a leaky clay pot, trying to decide whether enough drips had passed to announce nap time. Historians still debate whether these clocks were actually used for naps or just for religious rituals, but the timing lines often blurred. He even standardizes meal times, which seems logical until you realize that food supplies vary wildly across the empire. If your grain shipment is late, good luck sticking to the schedule. He's thrilled to shut his shop and flop onto a cool tile floor for a nap. But a blacksmith in rainy Aachen, he might prefer to keep his forge going while the daylight lasts. Mandating the same nap schedule for both creates friction. The problem: standardizing naps sounds simple until you realize that different parts of the empire live wildly different lives. In his view, what if God wanted you to be awake during a vision, or to help a neighbor in crisis? Monks already lived by the rule of Saint Benedict, which required a strict balance of prayer, labor, and rest. Charlemagne's policies overlapped with this, but they also added a layer of imperial bureaucracy. Now abbots had to report not just on prayer schedules, but on nap compliance. Did Brother Hugo fall asleep at the correct hour? Did Sister Bertha nap too long and miss Vespers? A nap mandate could block spiritual opportunities. It's not exactly heresy to say this, but it's close enough to make the court uncomfortable. Some regions actually rebelled not with swords, but with sleep schedules. In parts of Lombardy, locals simply ignored the emperor's timing rules and stuck to their own traditions. Did Charlemagne send troops over a nap dispute? No, but reports did reach his court complaining about irregular observances of rest. Historians still argue whether these reports were real concerns or just bureaucratic nitpicks from overzealous monks. A merchant in Barcelona, for example, deals with hot afternoons and blazing sun. Quirky fact. Meanwhile, the emperor's own scholars begin to worry about the philosophical side of all this. One monk in St. Gall writes a treatise questioning whether setting fixed hours for sleep might interfere with divine providence. Back at the palace, though, Charlemagne doubles down. Still, the emperor's intentions seem genuine. He isn't trying to make life harder. He's trying to create unity. Quirky side note. Charlemagne's court even experimented with early mechanical timekeeping devices, primitive water clocks called clepsydras. Meanwhile, life for regular folks continued much as it always had. But in monasteries and courtly estates, the rules tightened. It sounds ridiculous, but think about the implications. This wasn't just about sleep, it was about obedience. There were, of course, loopholes. Traveling officials often ignored the nap mandate, claiming that the demands of the road overruled rest. Historians still puzzle over how strictly the military followed the emperor's daily rhythm. Despite these inconsistencies, the royal nap program persisted. Charlemagne believed that small habits shape big empires. But there's an irony here. By forcing such strict schedules, Charlemagne may have accidentally sparked early debates about personal time. Quirky medical fact, through it all, the empire hummed on. The sun rose, the bells rang. Scrolls were copied, borders were guarded. It's strange to think about, but for a few decades in medieval Europe, sleep was political. And as you drift alongside them, you can almost hear the soft rustle of linen pillows, the quiet exhale of nobles reclining in carved chairs, the drip of a water clock counting out seconds in a shadowed corner. Time marches on, but for now, the empire sleeps. As you settle deeper into this tale, body relaxed, eyelids heavier, you begin to notice how Charlemagne's nap initiative seeps beyond his court and into the far corners of his empire. This isn't just about a few nobles lying back after lunch anymore. The emperor's standardized rest plan is spreading to places he can't directly supervise, thanks to an unlikely ally, the church. See, monasteries were like the administrative hubs of the medieval world. They weren't just for prayer and cheese-making. They were the libraries, hospitals, and sometimes even the post offices of their time. So when Charlemagne wanted to enforce a new daily rhythm across the empire, he naturally leaned on the monks. Some monasteries installed special sleeping benches in their cloisters called dormitoria. Parish priests rang their bells at prescribed hours, sometimes confusing the locals. Imagine you're a farmer in a tiny Frankish village, knee-deep in sheep dung, when suddenly the church bell tolls for naps. These texts, called ordinatio, detailed everything from when to plant crops to how to care for horses to, naturally, when to sleep. It's mostly about pigs and vineyards, but buried inside are instructions on supervising household servants, including when they should rest. That meant adopting imperial nap routines, even if they secretly thought it was silly. You can almost hear a bored countess in Burgundy muttering, "Fine, I'll lie down." Historians still argue whether this was an act of devotion or passive rebellion. Either way, it turns out that telling people when to sleep is like telling them how to dream. Not as easy as it sounds. But if someone steals my goats while I'm asleep, that's on Charlemagne. He held meetings with bishops and abbots to adjust the schedule for feast days and fasting seasons. Merchants complained that naps cut into trading hours. Soldiers grumbled about having to adjust drills. Did the emperor really think he could regulate the entire empire's sleep cycles? He built a clock of habits, a system of rhythms that shaped life itself. Or was this more about setting a cultural tone, sending a message that order mattered, even in the smallest things? Because sleep, no matter how regulated, still belongs to the dreamer. Bells tolling softly in distant monasteries, nobles sighing into their cushions. Monks folding their hands, eyes fluttering closed. A whole continent breathing in unison, not because it wanted to, but because the emperor said so. Peasants mostly ignored the rules when no one was watching. And somewhere in a quiet cloister, a monk probably asked the question that still lingers, does God care when I sleep, or just that I serve him well? If your black bile was too high, you risked waking from a nap feeling melancholy. If you wanted to be part of Charlemagne's grand empire, you followed the schedule. No questions asked, well, okay, some whispered complaints, but no official protests. If your phlegm was out of balance, you might drool embarrassingly. People worried about these things because health was seen as a delicate cosmic balance. Sleep too much, you'd get sluggish. Sleep too little, you'd fall out of favor with the stars or, worse, with the emperor. After all, nobody wanted to nap right after eating 40 pancakes on Shrove Tuesday. So, in a way, Charlemagne was micromanaging not just his nobles, but his gardeners and butlers too. People started finding creative ways to bend the rules. Some monasteries developed the habit of half naps, resting one eye while the other kept watch for visitors or, let's be honest, for snack deliveries. Others treated nap time as quiet meditation, staying technically awake, but lying very still, loopholing, medieval style. You can picture a monk hunched over parchment by candlelight, carefully copying the section on appropriate hours of repose. Do you actually stop what you're doing? Some did, some didn't, and some probably muttered, sure, I'll nap right after the sheep stops biting me. These weren't cozy beds with fluffy mattresses. Think more along the lines of cold stone slabs with scratchy wool blankets, no wrist watches, no phone alarms. Just the deep echo of bronze bells rolling across hillsides, telling everyone when to rest. Comfort wasn't the goal, obedience was. Even sleep had to be humble. If you've got an empire full of people who can't read, the clergy become your human megaphones. Monasteries took this role seriously. Bells began ringing at specific times, not just for prayers, but for naps. The monks, already used to strict schedules thanks to the rule of Saint Benedict, simply folded the imperial nap time into their day. Noon bell, that wasn't just for lunch anymore, it was a signal to stop, lie down, and rest. Quirky fact: after all, a well-rested monk is less likely to fall asleep during evening prayers, but he is also less likely to rebel if his schedule is micromanaged. But as the church embraced Charlemagne's standardized rest, theological debates got louder. Scholars argued about whether napping on command aligned with Christian virtue. Some said yes, rest was part of God's plan. Others worried that enforced naps could lead to sloth, which, last time anyone checked, was one of the 7 deadly sins. Historians still disagree on whether Charlemagne's naptime rules were truly adopted out of spiritual conviction or simply political convenience. Meanwhile, the rural churches tried to keep up. Still, the bell system caught on, becoming one of history's first mass time management tools. At the same time, Charlemagne's bureaucrats were busy writing manuals, yes, literal instruction booklets for managing daily life. Quirky side note, one of these documents, the Capitulaire de Villis, includes guidelines for managing royal estates. This created ripple effects across the empire. Aristocrats wanted to appear loyal, so they mimicked court life. But enforcing naps wasn't as simple as ringing bells and writing manuals. There's also evidence of monks secretly reading during mandatory naps, hiding manuscripts under their cloaks. Meanwhile, at the imperial court, Charlemagne continued to refine his policies. Quirky medical tidbit: some healers of the time believed that naps should align with the humors, those for bodily fluids medieval doctors obsessed over. By this point, the nap standardization had become so ingrained that new generations grew up thinking this was just how civilized life worked. But even as this new rhythm of life settled in, cracks kept showing. Historians still debate how much of Charlemagne's daily schedule was actually enforceable. Either way, by the late years of his reign, Charlemagne had succeeded in doing something remarkable. He didn't just build roads or conquer territories. As you drift alongside these medieval scenes, you can almost hear the layered sounds of the empire at rest. And yet, somewhere under that heavy lid of routine, people's minds wandered. They dreamed, they rebelled quietly in thought. As you settle further into the quiet hum of this strange, sleepy empire, you begin to realize that Charlemagne's standardized nap project wasn't just about comfort, it became part of his legacy machine. You see, When rulers can't be everywhere at once, they leave behind symbols. Some kings build monuments, some mint coins with their faces on them. Charlemagne, he left behind a clock-shaped empire. By now, his subjects weren't just used to napping, they were trained to follow a day carved into predictable chunks. Wake, pray, work, nap, repeat. Life became a rhythm, and like any catchy rhythm, it stuck in people's heads. He called councils big gatherings of bishops, abbots, nobles, and the occasional overworked scribe where they debated the nitty-gritty details of daily schedules. Charlemagne famously pushed for the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning that brought back literacy, Latin, and classical knowledge. Schools sprang up in monasteries and churches. And guess what those schools taught alongside reading and writing? Time management. One surviving document, the Admonitio Generalis, outlines rules for education, church conduct, and yes, daily rest. Lessons, meals, and naps were scheduled down to the hour, especially for those training to become clergy or administrators. It wasn't just about knowledge, it was about discipline. You can almost hear a weary young monk in training whispering, "Do I really have to nap if I'm not tired?" Was this about health, or was it a power move? Artists painted frescoes showing serene scenes of noble families reclining in shaded courtyards. Even architecture changed. Slightly wealthy homes added dedicated nap rooms with thick curtains and cool stone walls to block out the afternoon sun. Historians still debate whether he used naps as a polite way to stall negotiations. Warriors joked about sleepy Franks who'd rather nap than fight. There's even a record of a Saxon chieftain calling Charlemagne's men feather bellies, implying they spent too much time on cushions. Was this fair? Probably not, considering Charlemagne's military track record. But it shows that the nap rules weren't universally admired. Either way, imagine the frustration of envoys waiting outside his chamber, staring at the sundial, thinking, is he seriously napping right now? The answer was usually yes. Visiting envoys from foreign lands were expected to adjust to the imperial rhythm. That meant attending meetings at precise hours and resting during prescribed nap times. You can picture an ambassador from Al-Andalus, used to late-night socializing, suddenly being told, "Sorry, we'll resume negotiations after the nap bell." Bells rang in steady cadence, carving the day into manageable, predictable segments. And through it all, Charlemagne kept refining the routine, believing that order, especially in sleep, could lead to peace. It must have felt like trying to close a business deal in the middle of a mandatory yoga retreat. He didn't write much about it directly, but his laws and letters are filled with references to time, rhythm, and daily life. For him, managing sleep wasn't about micromanagement, it was about creating a civilization. It's kind of like a medieval operations manual, only with more prayers and fewer troubleshooting sections. The creak of wooden shutters closing for midday rest, the gentle drone of monks humming lullabies they half believe in. These rhymes weren't exactly billboard hits, but they worked. In cities like Frankfurt and Lyon, market stalls began closing during the imperial rest period. Imagine today as shopping malls locking their doors at exactly the same hour across an entire continent, not for a holiday, but because the emperor said it was time for a nap. Some merchants loved it, others hated it, especially those who made money during lunch breaks. One went something like, at midday rest, at vesper pray, at night reflect, then greet the day. It sounds soothing, but imagine reciting that every day until it becomes muscle memory. You'd probably start muttering it in your sleep. Even after the emperor was gone. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In his later years, Charlemagne continued refining his nap-time vision, believing it would stabilize the realm for future generations. Were there nap police wandering the streets, checking if you were horizontal enough? Probably not, but the pressure to conform was real, especially among the upper classes. After all, in Charlemagne's court, even the way you closed your eyes could signal political loyalty. Quirky fact, some monasteries started composing lullabies specifically for imperial nap periods. These weren't sweet nursery rhymes, they were chants in Latin, slow and droning, meant to help monks ease into a holy rest state. Picture a room full of adults, humming in unison, trying to convince themselves they're tired even if they aren't. Kind of like that time you stayed at your friend's house and they went to bed at 8 p.m., so you awkwardly lay there, staring at the ceiling, pretending to sleep. Same vibe. As Charlemagne aged, his court physicians started worrying about his own sleep habits. After all, being emperor isn't exactly relaxing. He was known to rise early, conduct affairs of state before sunrise, and only later settle into rest. Some scholars believe Charlemagne developed a segmented sleep pattern, napping during the day, then rising at intervals at night to pray or read. Was this by choice or necessity? Historians still debate whether his sleep was regulated by policy or by insomnia. At the same time, his nap program began creeping into education. Students learned to divide their day the imperial way. Quirky side note: some students developed mnemonic poems to remember the daily routine, including the timing of naps. Meanwhile, outside the schools and monasteries, merchants and townsfolk tried to adapt. Historians still argue over how much of this was strictly enforced versus socially encouraged. And speaking of politics, the nap schedule started influencing diplomacy. Quirky diplomatic tidbit: some reports claim Charlemagne once delayed a treaty signing because it fell during his rest window. Meanwhile, the cultural ripple effects continued. Poets wrote verses about the peaceful midday rest, tying it to harmony and divine order. And yet, cracks remained beneath the surface. In frontier regions, places like Saxony, where resistance to imperial rule simmered, people sometimes mocked the nap schedule outright. Despite the teasing, the system held strong in the empire's core regions. Monks napped, nobles napped, children learned to nap. Historians still wonder if Charlemagne saw the nap schedule as his greatest achievement. And so, as you drift alongside this strange chapter of history, you can almost hear the layered sounds of medieval life, the shuffle of sandals on stone floors. The empire breathes in, the empire breathes out. And somewhere, beneath layers of parchment and policy, Charlemagne dreams of a world in sync. By now, you reach so deep into the folds of Charlemagne's empire that your own breathing probably matches the rhythm of those ancient naps. And just like you, the empire keeps snoozing along, predictable, ritualized, scheduled within an inch of its life. People get restless, unexpected events happen. And not everyone shares Charlemagne's obsession with order. So while the imperial core continues its midday slumber, new tensions bubble up along the edges of this sleepy program. So while part of the army rested, the other half kept an eye on the horizon for trouble. Was this efficient? Some say yes, others argue it led to groggy soldiers fumbling through nighttime defenses. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne's rest policies made the military sharper or softer. In Italy, for instance, the siesta culture already existed long before Charlemagne showed up. On paper, everyone was supposed to rest the same way. In practice, local customs often won out. For people living in the colder regions, enforced midday rest sometimes felt unnecessary. If you're wrapped in furs, chopping firewood in January, the last thing you want is to lie down and freeze. Quirky weather fact: some monasteries in the Alps officially suspended nap schedules during winter, citing cold-related health risks. Either way, pamphlets and lectures spread across the empire, adding layers of pseudoscience to the already tangled nap debate. In other words, it's too cold to nap, thanks. His hair, once thick and dark, turned snowy white, his legs weakened, his back stiffened, and like most older men, his sleep patterns became irregular. Some nights he paced the halls, other days, he nodded off mid-conversation. The constant wars drained resources, succession disputes loomed on the horizon. And no matter how many naps people took, life kept moving forward in messy, unpredictable ways. Yet he still insisted on modeling the schedule for his court, lying down for midday rest, even when his mind remained awake. But for now, in this quiet part of the story, the empire remains at rest. Others grumbled that naps cut into valuable hours for copying manuscripts or tending gardens. Quirky clerical tidbit: there are records of abbots fining monks for snoring too loudly during mandated rest periods, claiming it disrupted the holy silence. So yes, even in Charlemagne's carefully choreographed empire, you could get in trouble for being too enthusiastic about your nap. Some villages stuck to traditional sleep patterns, napping when it made sense for farming or fishing rather than when the imperial bells rang. Locals simply shrugged and said, "We've been napping since the Romans, thanks, welcome to the club." Historians still argue whether this was literal, metaphorical, or just palace gossip that stuck around because it sounded cool. But in places like Saxony and Bavaria, where pagan traditions still lingered, people saw the imperial nap schedule as just another foreign rule to endure or ignore. But as history tends to do, the neat little nap routine starts to get complicated. Some whispered in secret, some simply stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the stone. Some claimed the mandated naps were healthy, preventing melancholy and bad digestion. Others warned that sleeping too much during the day would make your humors sluggish, especially your phlegmatic temperament, which could lead to drooling and laziness. Charlemagne's later campaigns in Spain and along the northern coasts forced his armies into unpredictable schedules. Think of it as medieval multitasking, officially asleep, but unofficially scheming. Midday heat could be brutal, and resting in the shade was common long before Charlemagne's rules came along. For these folks, the emperor's policy probably felt like stating the obvious. Oh, you're telling us to nap at noon. Shocking idea. We've only been doing that since Caesar. You can imagine a count lying on a couch, eyes half-lidded, murmuring, "Psst. I'll trade you 3 goats and a mill if you help me claim that vineyard." Imagine trying to enforce a standardized nap in the middle of a siege. You can almost hear the captain barking, "Sorry lads, it's nap time, put down the battering ram." Yeah, that didn't go over well. See, the longer a system runs, the more it collides with real life. Let's start with the military. Soldiers are not exactly known for their love of naps, especially when there's a Viking raid on the horizon. Sure, they attended the prescribed naps when Charlemagne was around. But when he was off campaigning, many of them quietly adjusted the schedule to suit their lifestyles. Some held secret feasts during the official rest hours. Others used the time to plot land grabs or arrange politically advantageous marriages, quirky battlefield tidbit. Some commanders adapted by rotating naps in shifts, creating one of the earliest forms of military watch rotation in medieval Europe. Meanwhile, back at court, the nobles started playing fast and loose with the rules. Quirky fact, a few nobles allegedly turned nap time into clandestine meeting hours, whispering in darkened halls while pretending to rest. As the empire expanded, different regions developed their own interpretations of Charlemagne's rest guidelines. Historians still argue whether the nap mandate unified the empire or highlighted its cultural differences. And then there's the issue of climate. The empire stretched from chilly northern forests to the sun-baked plains of Aquitaine. On the flip side, in places like southern Gaul, napping wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. Meanwhile, medicine started chiming in with new opinions. Medieval doctors, still obsessed with balancing humors, began publishing treatises on correct sleep. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne's nap policy was influenced by these medical theories or whether the doctors were just retroactively justifying royal habits. Of course, the clergy had opinions too. Some monks embraced the system, seeing rest as part of divine order. Meanwhile, Charlemagne himself kept aging. Quirky imperial habit, Charlemagne allegedly dozed with one eye half open, claiming it helped him watch over the realm. Was this true vigilance or just grandpa-level napping? By this point, the empire was starting to show cracks in other areas too, but still, the daily rhythm continued. Bells rang, people lay down, some actually slept, and you, here in your own bed, might feel a bit of that same medieval stillness, the world pausing, time softening at the edges, the steady hum of life carrying on in spite of it all. Historians still wonder whether Charlemagne truly believed his nap policy would outlast him, or whether he knew, deep down, that human nature would eventually break free of the clock. So here you are, floating deeper into Charlemagne's empire, where naps have become as much a part of daily life as prayers, taxes, and awkward medieval haircuts. But time, as you probably noticed, doesn't stop for anyone, not even an emperor obsessed with controlling it. In fact, one report claims he once postponed a royal council because he refused to skip his midday rest. Picture dozens of dukes and bishops tapping their sandals, waiting for the emperor to finish his power snooze. It's like canceling a board meeting because your Fitbit told you it was time for a lie down. As Charlemagne's health declined in his final years, his carefully scheduled world began to wobble. He still insisted on the naps, of course. But beyond the palace walls, things got messy. Succession was looming. In trading hubs like Aachen and Toulouse, shopkeepers started quietly extending their hours, pushing the boundaries of the official nap break. This way, they could claim they were following imperial rules while secretly hustling for sales. Was this genius or just early capitalism? Historians still debate whether this counts as compliance or loophole culture. He even had sections of his palaces redesigned to include special nap chambers, cooled stone rooms with thick curtains to block out the sun, the medieval equivalent of blackout blinds. One surviving architectural plan shows a dedicated quiet room next to the audience hall in Aachen. He worried about clocks, not mechanical ones, of course, since those wouldn't be invented for centuries, but about the metaphorical clock of civilization. Some medieval scholars believed that the structure of time mirrored the structure of the cosmos, that regular naps weren't just good for the body, but helped align humanity with the celestial order. But deep down, he must have known that no system is permanent. He died in Aachen, surrounded by clergy, physicians, and probably at least one poor soul scribbling down his last words. According to legend, he asked for Psalm 31 to be read aloud as he slipped away. Did he die during a nap? Some sources suggest he passed quietly after midday rest, but historians still argue about that detail. It's one of those historical moments blurred by time, wrapped in just enough mystery to keep scholars guessing. Suns rebel, borders shift, people stop following the rules once the emperor's not looking. The bells may have stopped ringing, but the idea remains that somewhere, somehow, the clock of history once ticked to the rhythm of a nap. In this view, taking a nap wasn't lazy. It was cosmic maintenance, like tuning an invisible harp that kept the universe from wobbling off-key. Could his system keep running without him? Would people still pause at midday, pray, rest, and reset? You can imagine courtiers slipping in there between meetings, trying to catch 15 minutes without crumpling their tunics. Some markets stayed open just long enough to catch travelers passing through, hoping to make a few extra coins before the bells rang. For a while, no one dared move them. They just sat there, gathering dust, like ancient throw pillows no one's brave enough to donate. Charlemagne had multiple sons, but his oldest, Pepin the Hunchback, had already been sidelined due to, well, the hunchback thing and some unfortunate rebellion attempts. He kept the nap periods, the bells, the monastic schedules, but cracks appeared quickly. Nobles grumbled, soldiers demanded flexibility. Merchants pushed for longer market hours. The Carolingian court whispered about whether the old emperor's sleep rules were still relevant. But because he was obsessed with fairness sometimes to the point of being paralyzed by indecision. Envoys from Byzantium, used to long banquets and late-night negotiations, found it bizarre to be told, come back after nap time. Either way, the empire carried on, now without its sleepy architect at the helm. Some left grumbling that the Franks were more interested in their pillows than in politics. Was Charlemagne modeling a balanced life, or was he just really tired? And yes, there are records of at least one ambassador from the Abbasid Caliphate sending back reports that the Frankish court conducts affairs in half days. With half the vigor, historians still argue whether Louis inherited Charlemagne's love of schedules or just went along with the nap system because it was easier than changing it. That left his son Louis, the one history calls Louis the Pious, to inherit the empire. His attendants reported that he read Augustine's City of God between naps, pondering the fate of souls, while the empire quietly hummed along outside his window. Did he worry about the legacy of his nap project? Probably. Or maybe he just wanted to rest his joints without interruption. Quirky royal family fact. Louis was nicknamed the Fair, not just for his good looks. As Charlemagne's body weakened, his routine became even more rigid. Some days he barely left his chambers. Meanwhile, the empire kept ticking. Monasteries rang bells for the prescribed rest times. Villages paused work at midday. In some places, the nap period had become so ingrained that people felt anxious if they skipped it, a phenomenon modern researchers would probably call medieval sleep FOMO. You know the feeling, that weird guilt when you're supposed to be resting, but instead you're re-scrolling through your mental to-do list. Same energy, just without smartphones. Not everyone played along, though. The merchant class was growing restless, quirky workaround. In some towns, merchants hired nap stand-ins, usually young apprentices or bored relatives, to sit in their stalls pretending to be asleep, while actually keeping watch for customers. At the same time, foreign visitors struggled with the empire's sleepy schedule. Charlemagne's response: he doubled down. In his letters, he continued to promote the rhythm of rest, seeing it as part of his civilizing mission. Historians still argue whether this was about health, humility, or simple exhaustion. As the emperor's body failed, his mind kept returning to time. Quirky philosophical tidbit? Charlemagne liked that idea. In his letters, he wrote about rest as balance, as if the empire itself breathed in cycles: wake, work, nap, repeat. By 814, Charlemagne's health finally gave out. With Charlemagne gone, the empire faced a strange question: what happens to a system built so heavily around one man's daily routine? Louis the Pious took the throne and tried to maintain the rhythm. Quirky continuity fact: Louis's court retained Charlemagne's official naptime pillows, embroidered silk cushions, stored in the treasury as imperial relics. Historians still debate whether the nap system truly collapsed after Charlemagne or whether it just slowly faded into cultural habit. And you, drifting further into your own rest, might feel the ghost of that world lingering. As you glide further into this twilight of Charlemagne's empire, you find yourself in a world where the nap schedule has become less of a law and more of a legend. The emperor is gone, but his peculiar experiment in synchronizing slumber with sovereignty still hums faintly in the background of daily life. Like an old screensaver no one bothers to turn off. Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, inherited the imperial pillow, so to speak. And at first, he tried to keep things exactly as his father had left them, not exactly prime napping conditions. Historians still argue whether the rise in Viking attacks contributed to the gradual unraveling of Charlemagne's rest mandate. Some say yes, because emergencies don't pause for sleep. It's a risky strategy, but hey, if everyone else is snoring, you might as well multitask. Others think the naps were already fading, and the Vikings were just the chaotic cherry on top. Maybe Brother Hugo was just jealous of Brother Bernard's ability to fall asleep in 5 seconds flat. Others pushed back, arguing that too much sleep made monks lazy. One fiery abbot in Lyon allegedly banned naps altogether, claiming, "The devil naps not, so neither shall we." Bold words, considering most of his monks probably fell asleep in the chapel anyway. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne's policies directly influenced the modern siesta, or whether he just codified something people were already doing. It's a chicken or egg problem, wrapped in a blanket, lying under a shady olive tree. It is not clear whether this was serious medical advice or just a backhanded reference to the empire's collapse. Either way, it stuck. Bells still chimed at midday. Courtiers still retired to their chambers, slipping under wool blankets for their official rests. But that's the thing about routines: they fade from law into habit, from habit into legend, and from legend into bedtime stories, like the one you're hearing now. Work, rest, no empire required. Some towns rang bells at midday, well into the Middle Ages, even when no one remembered exactly why. Maybe it was all three, or maybe, like you, he just got really cranky without a proper rest. In rural areas, farmers still took short rests after lunch, not because a law told them to, but because their bodies needed it. But unlike his father, Louis lacked the iron will to enforce compliance across the empire. In some regions, it was still practiced out of habit. There's at least one report from the Carolingian Chancery, basically the empire's paperwork factory, that describes clerks refusing to process royal orders during the sacred hour of repose, and surprisingly durable. Even during emergencies, that's dedication to the nap cause, or possibly just medieval bureaucratic stalling at its finest. And imagine the soft shuffle of medieval slippers on stone floors as courtiers tucked themselves into bed, just like you. In others, it faded entirely. And in the political chaos of the 840s and 850s, no one had time to lie down in the middle of the day anymore. The empire had bigger problems, like figuring out who actually ruled what. Nobles began interpreting the nap policy loosely. Some shortened it to a brief repose, others turned it into personal leisure time, using the official rest period for whatever suited them best: falconry, chess, or whispered political plotting over spiced wine. His descendants squabbled over territory. Kingdoms split into East Francia, West Francia, and Lotharingia. The royal nap cushions were packed away, gathering dust in forgotten corners of palaces. Life went on, but not on Charlemagne's clock. Louis the Pious struggled to juggle the empire's demands. His brothers and nephews started eyeing the throne. Border conflicts popped up like weeds. And the Vikings, those energetic Norsemen with absolutely no respect for anyone's nap schedule, began raiding coastal towns. In some places, napping had become so habitual that people didn't know what to do if they skipped it. Monks in Tours reportedly confessed feelings of sinful restlessness when forced to work through nap hour. Quirky fact, one Benedictine abbey in Metz even wrote a hymn called the Blessed Pause, meant to be sung right before nap time, thanking God for the gift of sleep. It's basically a medieval lullaby, but with more Latin and fewer plush toys. But the political landscape was shifting, and the nap system couldn't quite keep pace. Imagine being a Frankish villager, lying down for your midday rest as the bells ring, only to hear the distant sound of longships scraping onto the shore. Meanwhile, Louis tried to keep the dream alive literally. He issued edicts reaffirming the importance of structured rest. Quirky noble workaround. At least one count in Burgundy reportedly scheduled all his secret affairs, both political and romantic, for nap time, knowing fewer eyes would be watching. In monasteries, the debate over naps intensified. Some orders doubled down, making midday rest a cornerstone of their spiritual discipline. Historians still debate whether the monastic backlash against naps was theological or just an early version of office politics. As the empire fractured first into administrative pieces, then into outright civil war, the nap system became more and more symbolic. Quirky administrative collapse tidbit. By the late 9th century, Charlemagne's grand vision of an empire united by synchronized naps had mostly dissolved. Still, some echoes of his sleepy system remained. In southern France and parts of Italy, the tradition of the midday pause lingered. In northern Europe, the formalized nap mostly faded, but traces of it show up in old village customs. And then there's the weird cultural hangover of Charlemagne's nap policy. In some medieval medical texts, there's advice against napping for political reasons, warning that too much sleep can lead to missed opportunities or betrayals. By the time the Carolingian dynasty fizzled out in the 10th century, the dream of an empire unified by naps had become just another quirky footnote in European history. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne's nap system was a bold social experiment, a control mechanism, or just an emperor's personal quirk imposed on millions of people. And now, lying in your own bed centuries later, you're still part of the same human cycle. The bells might have stopped ringing, but the urge to pause, to close your eyes, to drift, to let the weight of the day float away, that's universal. So go ahead, loosen your jaw, let your shoulders sink deeper into your pillow. You drift now through a world where Charlemagne's grand experiment has quietly slipped into memory. His empire, once bound by swords, prayers, and naps, has scattered into patchworks of smaller kingdoms and quarrelsome lords. But even as the official royal naptime policies crumbled, the idea of rest as ritual refused to vanish completely. In southern regions, especially across parts of modern-day Spain and southern France, the habit of resting after the midday meal dug in its heels. Some historians trace this directly back to Charlemagne's standardized nap rules, claiming his policies planted the seeds of what would later become the siesta culture. Castles replaced palaces, and monks continued debating the theological merits of sleep. Some monasteries kept the practice of resting after lunch, especially in warmer regions. Others cut it out entirely, viewing midday naps as distractions from prayer and labor. Farmers still pause during the hottest part of the day, not because of Charlemagne's long-gone laws, but because they'd sweat through 3 layers of wool by noon. In towns, merchants often closed their stalls for a short break, though sometimes just to guard against thieves while they grabbed lunch. The Latin phrase sexta hora, meaning the 6th hour of the day, was used to describe both the time of noon and, gradually, the act of taking a nap itself. In some busy marketplaces, merchants developed early buddy systems where neighboring shopkeepers would watch each other's goods during rest breaks, creating an informal security network powered by trust and shared exhaustion. Charlemagne's letters, including his nap-related mandates, survived in dusty monasteries and royal archives. Truly, this emperor loved his rest. If only he'd napped through more wars. Dry humor survived the Dark Ages, apparently. Either way, they revealed that Charlemagne's naptime obsession was remembered, even if not always respected. And in quiet corners of libraries and monasteries, scholars kept copying Charlemagne's documents, ensuring his obsession with scheduled rest would survive long after his empire disintegrated. Students in cathedral schools sometimes copied these documents by hand, occasionally adding sarcastic notes in the margins. They marveled at the idea of an emperor trying to regulate rest across an entire continent. Historians still argue whether he was directly inspired by Charlemagne or just independently weird about sleep. Some villages passed down stories of kings who ruled by the clock, who demanded that the sun and moon obey their schedules. These weren't always directly linked to Charlemagne, but the themes lined up: time control, order, rest, and the danger of overreaching power. Humanist scholars joked about it in letters. One called Charlemagne the father of midday slumbers, a nickname that never quite caught on, but probably should have. Imagine the soft rustle of parchment, the scribes copying Charlemagne's sleepy edicts by candlelight, stifling yawns as they work. Somewhere, a bell rings for rest, but no one's quite sure why anymore. It's just tradition now. You could almost call it the original sleep shift. Charlemagne's structured naps may have been less of an odd quirk and more of a formalization of what humans naturally did before industrial clocks forced us into strict 9-to-5 lives. Your body knows the rhythm, the pull of gravity, the slowing heartbeat, the way thoughts start to wander and meld together. You've been coasting through centuries of naps, and the lines between them and now have blurred. One Norman knight allegedly wrote home complaining that the locals fought in the morning, feasted at midday, then vanished into their homes to sleep while the sun still shone. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, like most things involving sleep, where no one's quite awake enough to be certain. Sounds like someone forgot to pack a travel pillow. Over centuries, sextomorphed into siesta. So in a weird way, every time someone says siesta, they're echoing a term from the Roman Empire that Charlemagne helped preserve. Others point out that hot afternoons practically demand rest, regardless of imperial edicts. Depending on which monk you ask, a nap could either bring you closer to God or slide you straight into sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. It's like spiritual whiplash, but with blankets. The Normans, for example, were famously disdainful of daytime sleep, preferring action over repose. The Italian city-states, on the other hand, embraced midday breaks, turning them into elaborate social rituals that involved food, family, and sometimes a bit of scandalous gossip behind closed shutters. Quirky linguistic tidbit, but in the north places like Saxony, East Francia, and the Low Countries, the nap ritual became more of a joke than a law. Noble courts started using the hour of rest as a euphemism for avoiding responsibilities. If you wanted to dodge an awkward conversation or delay paying taxes, you might say, but it's time for repose. That's the medieval equivalent of putting your phone on Do Not Disturb. By the 11th century, European life had shifted into new rhythms. Feudalism took hold. Historians still argue whether the church encouraged naps as a spiritual reset or condemned them as signs of moral weakness. Outside the cloisters, ordinary people did whatever made sense, quirky medieval workaround. Meanwhile, in academic circles, scholars began collecting and commenting on old Carolingian texts. There is one preserved manuscript from the 12th century where a scribe scribbled next to a copy of Charlemagne's sleep decree. Historians still debate whether these marginal notes reflect actual criticism or just the medieval version of doodling in the margins during a boring lecture. Across Europe, different cultures developed their own attitudes toward rest, quirky cross-cultural moment. When the Normans invaded southern Italy in the 11th century, they were baffled by local siesta habits. But even with all these variations, the basic human pattern persisted: work, pause, sleep, repeat. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, some intellectuals rediscovered these old texts. Quirky Renaissance side note: Leonardo da Vinci, famous for his polyphasic sleep schedule, napping multiple times a day, might have stumbled across references to medieval rest patterns during his studies. Meanwhile, in folklore, echoes of the old nap system lingered. And in modern sleep science, researchers studying Bafosic sleepwear, people naturally sleep into chunks, one at night and one in the day, sometimes point back to medieval patterns as evidence. Historians still debate whether medieval Europe was truly a two-sleep society, or whether these rest periods were just flexible adaptations to daylight, climate, and culture. And now you, listening in your dimly lit room, are part of this long, sleepy story. So take a slow breath, let your eyelids drift lower. And sometimes, tradition is enough. The centuries keep flowing beneath you like a slow, sleepy river, and you drift with them into the twilight of Charlemagne's legacy. His empire is long gone, broken into fragments, but the traces of his nap obsession are still tucked into unexpected corners of history like crumbs between couch cushions. In the Middle Ages, as kingdoms rose and fell, the idea of rest as a structured ritual faded from official policies but found new life in daily routines. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many towns across Europe had something called the noon bell. It was usually rung to mark the midday prayer angelus time, But in some places, it also doubled as a quiet reminder to stop, breathe, and, if you wanted, slip away for a quick rest. Suddenly, time wasn't just tied to the sun's position or the tolling of church bells. It became a thing you could measure with gears, springs, and ticking hands. This led to stricter schedules, especially in bustling cities like Florence, Paris, and London, where commerce ran on the clock. Some scholars argue that structured naps became a victim of capitalism, replaced by longer workdays and tighter schedules. Others suggest the habit simply adapted, surviving in rural life and quieter towns while cities moved toward non-stop hustle. Quirky fact: some medieval towns had specific public benches called repose stones placed under shady trees, where townsfolk were encouraged to sit and rest after lunch. Spanish conquistadors noted that people in Central and South America also paused for midday rest, which led to curious comparisons. Some Europeans viewed this as proof that their own siesta traditions were natural and universal, not just cultural leftovers from Charlemagne's era. Voltaire, for example, joked about Charlemagne's nap edicts in his letters, calling them the emperor's softest command. He called it his philosophical intermission. Factory work demanded long, continuous hours. Naps were pushed to the margin, something for the very young, the very old, or the idle rich. But even then, echoes of Charlemagne's experiment lingered. But even Voltaire admitted he enjoyed a good rest after lunch, usually while pretending to read. Families gathered for long meals, followed by quiet rest. In rural villages, you'd still hear bells ringing at midday, not to enforce a law, but to mark the natural pause of the day. By the Renaissance, physicians and scholars started writing medical treatises about sleep again. It wasn't about Charlemagne anymore, but the spirit was oddly similar, a recognition that rest has social value, not just personal benefit. A soft chime, not urgent, just there to tell you, it's okay to pause. Sleep is the one ritual no empire can fully control, but oh, how they've tried. To let go of the day's edges, to drift, they advise taking a gentle pause after meals, especially for digestion. Probably all three, blending together like a long, lazy afternoon. They point out that humans might not be designed for a single block of sleep at night, but for segmented pattern sleep, wake, sleep again. Some researchers argue that Charlemagne's nap rules accidentally aligned with our biological clocks. Others think he was just making royal whimsy into law, because when you're emperor, why not? Some texts even warned of the dangers of skipping rest, blaming insomnia, melancholy, and even digestive issues on the failure to nap. These were sometimes engraved with religious symbols, as if to suggest that pausing for a nap was just as holy as going to church. Your breathing slows, your eyes grow heavier. And part of you wonders, what would life be like if the world still rang bells to remind everyone to rest? One 16th-century physician claimed that skipping your afternoon nap could cause wandering humors in the stomach, leading to bad dreams, poor memory, and oddly an increased tendency to gossip. Imagine that, all of your oversharing is just because you're sleep-deprived. It's a classic case of parallel evolution, or maybe just common sense, when the sun hits its peak. Historians still argue whether this was a direct continuation of Charlemagne's policies, or just another example of human beings figuring out how to survive the midday slump without coffee. But there's no denying that the rhythm of work-rest work survived long after the emperor's decree had faded. Fast forward to the 15th century, and the invention of mechanical clocks started to change everything. Quirky side effect: in some towns, people resisted the tyranny of the mechanical clock by deliberately ignoring it during rest hours. In Milan, for example, merchants would often close shop at midday no matter what the clock said, following older, sun-based traditions. There's even a record of one frustrated clockmaker writing, "What good is precision if no one listens to the hour?" Historians still debate whether the rise of mechanical timekeeping directly killed the nap culture, or whether naps just quietly retreated into private spaces. But even in the busiest places, the body's natural urge for rest didn't go away. Quirky medical belief. Meanwhile, travelers from Europe began writing about other cultures' rest habits. Historians still argue whether the siesta spread from Europe to the New World, or if it developed independently in different regions due to climate and human biology. In France, the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century started poking fun at the idea of napping as an official policy. Quirky literary footnote: Jean-Jacques Rousseau the philosopher famous for writing about nature and society, reportedly kept a strict personal nap schedule and refused to meet visitors during his rest hours. By the 19th century, industrialization took a hammer to traditional rest rhythms. In southern Europe, the siesta culture held on, particularly in Spain and parts of Italy. Shops closed in the afternoon. Quirky political moment. In 1930s Spain, there was actually a government proposal to formally protect the siesta as a national cultural practice. Historians still debate whether modern siesta customs are relics of medieval mandates, ancient traditions, or simply adaptations to geography and weather. Even today, sleep scientists and cultural anthropologists study the effects of midday rest. And so here you are, centuries later, wrapped in your blanket, listening to stories about long-gone emperors and their sleepy societies. Maybe not so bad, you can almost hear the faint echo of those bells now, carried across time. So sink deeper into your bed, knowing you're part of a tradition that's older than alarms, older than deadlines, older even than Charlemagne's mighty empire. And now you float gently toward the last stretch of this story, the quiet aftermath of an empire's peculiar obsession with naps. By the time the 20th century rolled in, the world had become faster, louder, and less forgiving of midday pauses. But even so, the echoes of Charlemagne's royal rest policies still whispered in unexpected places. In modern France, the phrase repos du midi, the midday rest, survived in rural life well into the 1900s. Many small French villages routinely closed shops, post offices, and even government buildings between noon and 2 o'clock. But the coincidence is too perfect to ignore. A powerful ruler once tried to make naps mandatory, and somehow, parts of Europe still politely refused to schedule important things at 2 p.m. They called it Carolingian time management. It didn't catch on. Turns out programmers don't love being told when to nap by an emperor who has been dead for 1,200 years. Passengers knew not to complain after all. Who argues with an entire country's commitment to digestion? Schools experiment with later start times to accommodate adolescent sleep cycles. Either way, the human need for rest remains as persistent as ever. We still get sleepy, we still crave pauses. And sometimes, whether by personal choice or imperial decree, we have to close our eyes for a while. Apps track your REM patterns and suggest power naps of precisely 26 minutes because apparently, anything longer would make you groggy, and anything shorter would leave you craving a donut. But as an old man wrapped in a fur cloak, dozing peacefully in his palace at Aachen, let the hum of modern life fade to the background. The kind you steal under a desk at work, or the kind you share with a cat on a rainy afternoon. In this quiet, suspended moment, you're no longer tied to schedules or alarms. The emails, the deadlines, the to-do lists, they'll all still be there tomorrow. There's no need to hold on to facts or timelines anymore. Let them drift away, like parchment pages curling softly at the edges, forgotten on a quiet desk. But for now, you get to follow the oldest command of all. Close your eyes, breathe softly, and let sleep take over. Your muscles unwind, like they've been waiting all day for this. Your breathing slows into a natural rhythm, steady, calm, almost like the ticking of an old medieval clock, but softer, more forgiving. You're just another human being, resting as millions before you have done. The warm light of a Frankish afternoon filters through arched windows. Outside, the wind carries the faintest whisper of bells, distant and sleepy, marking the hour of rest. One human being among millions, lying still beneath the same sky, following the same primal need to close your eyes and let go. Maybe you'll dream of ancient halls, or of monks softly snoring in cloisters, or of kings dozing off mid-sentence. Or maybe you won't dream at all, and that's perfectly fine. No deadlines, no expectations, just rest. You've learned about medieval sleep cycles, siesta customs, monks grumbling about naps, and kings drafting bedtime laws. And now, as the story winds down, your body is ready to do exactly what Charlemagne would have approved of: drift off. Somewhere, a clerk is nervously checking his notes, wondering if he remembered to schedule the royal nap bell on time. Globalization, tight work schedules, and the demands of capitalism chipped away at the long afternoon breaks. Yet in smaller towns and rural areas, you can still see metal shutters drop across storefronts in the early afternoon, just like they did 1,000 years ago. Studies on circadian rhythms reveal a natural dip in human alertness during the early afternoon, typically between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., regardless of culture or diet. Your body basically begs for a break, whether you're in medieval Aachen or modern Albuquerque. Whether or not anyone actually napped depended on the day, but the official break remained baked into the schedule like warm baguettes cooling in a shop window. Quirky leftover custom. Some French train conductors in the early 20th century refused to schedule local routes between 12:30 and 2 p.m., citing tradition rather than logistics. In Spain, siesta culture became famous worldwide, though modern cities have mostly phased it out. Historians still debate whether this persistence is a direct chain from Charlemagne's empire or just parallel cultural evolution. Meanwhile, in the world of sleep science, researchers now recognize the biological basis for afternoon drowsiness. Quirky modern experiment. In the early 2000s, a tech startup in Silicon Valley tried to create a productivity schedule based on historical sleep cycles, including Charlemagne's naptime mandates. But the conversation around rest continues to evolve. Today's companies install nap pods in offices. Historians still argue whether this is progress or just a return to older, more natural rhythms under the disguise of tech optimization. And there's something oddly comforting about that. For all our advancements, from smartphones to space travel, we haven't hacked our way out of basic biology. So let's take one last moment to picture Charlemagne not as the stern, sword-wielding emperor. Maybe the emperor dreams of his conquests, or maybe he dreams of simpler things, a quiet meadow, the rustle of grass, the soft rhythm of his own breathing. And perhaps, in this imagined moment, Charlemagne wouldn't mind knowing that you're here now, lying in your own bed, participating unknowingly in the same ancient ritual he once tried to enforce. You've listened patiently as we wandered through centuries of rest, regulation, and rebellion. So go ahead, let your eyelids fall. After all, history isn't just about battles and borders, it's also about naps. Long ones, short ones, scheduled ones, secret ones. And as you lie there, warm and heavy beneath your blankets, remember that the world can wait, because even emperors need naps. So now, everything softens, the centuries fade into a gentle blur, and the heavy weight of history lifts from your shoulders. The world around you grows quieter. Your bed feels like the safest place in the universe. Picture the last flickers of candlelight in a stone chamber, somewhere in Charlemagne's palace. The glow dims, the world cools, you're part of this long, unbroken chain now. So allow yourself to drift further, let your mind wander without direction. Right now, nothing else matters but sleep, just sleep.